Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about PREMIS. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so please just stay muted and we'll do questions at the end. We are recording this webinar and I'll email out a link to the recording tomorrow. We do have a YouTube channel where I post all of them. So if you subscribe to us, I think you'll get like an alert when we post it, but it'll be in your inbox tomorrow. And then please stay muted. We've got a bunch of people in this meeting. And just first off, Backlog is the name of my company. Backlog is hosting this webinar, and Sarah works with us as a digital archives consultant. We do archival needs assessments, policy writing, digitization plans, just kind of anything you need, all the odds and ends. And I'm Emma. I founded Backlog in 2021. We work with institutions across the country. We are based in St. Louis. Yeah, we work with a lot of digital archives, and this topic falls under that digital archive sphere. I'm going to give it to Sarah.
Hi, everybody. So as it says here, my day job is at Washington University, but I'm happy to be able to work for Backlog on special projects. There's a shout out here to the National Building Arts Center, where I volunteer. So today we're going to be talking about archival items, more typical archival items like digital objects, paper, photos, stuff like that, but it is also possible to archive buildings, and that's what the NBAC does. So if you're interested in that at all, I recommend checking it out. Next slide, please. Okay, so this webinar is going to be about PREMIS, which is a metadata schema that handles a particular type of metadata, but we're going to kind of start out with generally what is metadata. I'm sure we have many different people from all different corners of the archival or library worlds here with us today. So I'll try to kind of take care of the basics, but also get to specifics about PREMIS. So to start with some basics, we have here a cat, or more specifically, it's a picture of a cat. So the picture of the cat is what we're calling data. And then on the right, the metadata. So the data about the data. This could be any number of things. Depending on what data you have, you choose the right metadata to go with it. This photo of a cat needs a file name, other things. You can see there's a little map there. You might see that if you ever work with Google Photos or another app or program like that. So where the photo is taken or a geographical piece of metadata could be something that's relevant to your data. Hence the sort of stylized map in this picture. So yeah, just a kind of initial example of the object and the metadata that describes the object, so you kind of can have something in your head as we move forward. Next slide, please. Okay, what is metadata? It's data about data. That would be the dictionary definition, but what is that exactly? So metadata is descriptive or contextual information, which refers to or is associated with another object or resource. So this usually takes the form of a structured set of elements. Elements we'll be talking about a lot today. So this could be like fields, cells, it could be column headings, and those would be the elements. And those describe the information resource, and they assist in the identification, location, and the retrieval of it by users. It also facilitates content and access management. So that was the definition, the long definition, provided by the DCC, the Digital Curation Center. In archives and libraries, we have various like professional organizations that help us orient and get together on our work, kind of centralize our work. So the DCC solves challenges in digital curation that could not be tackled by any single institution or discipline. Thankfully, we have organizations like that. So without metadata, a digital resource might be irretrievable, unidentifiable, or unusable. Kind of ominous, but it really is. That's metadata is extremely important. Next slide, please. Okay, types of metadata. There are types. I know that there are a few types generally in, my day-to-day work. And I was like, I know that's controversial. Why don't I Google and see just how many types of metadata there are? So, anywhere from 3 to 20. When you're categorizing things, it can get very tricky because people want to categorize them in different ways. We have sort of global organizations like the DCC helping us out, but still it is very contentious. So if you hear about different types of metadata and it's somebody thinks a different number than you think, it's okay. We just sort of deal with that. Next slide, please. Okay, but we do need to have a framework in order to move forward. So I feel like most commonly you see either 3 or 6 types of metadata. 3 being kind of the biggest buckets: descriptive, administrative, or structural/technical. That did not include preservation, which is a focus today. So my sort of like second tier framework for thinking about types of metadata would be 6, which would include preservation. It would also include, it would kind of pull out geospatial as well, which refers to like those maps that we talked about a little bit ago. Next slide, please. Okay, so why are we using metadata? Think about if you are organizing your own books in your house. You might need to have like a very light system. If you have few books, or if they vary a lot by how they look, you could organize them by color. You could be like, oh, my favorite book is the tall red book. That's the one I pull off the shelf all the time. For digital information, it's more important. As it says here, digital information will be severely compromised if any one of these aspects is lost, because with digital information, you don't have the physical component. You can't go, I work in an archaeology archive. These are the skulls. They sit on the shelf. I have a pretty good handle of how to distinguish between them, organize them, refer to them. So we've got here the 3 bullet points. Physical is the storage media that holds the binary data. This would be like, I've got a text document and it lives in a Word document. It could also live in like a Google Doc or something else. Intellectual would be another category. So that would be like the added context that gives meaning to the data. Everything on a computer is made of zeros and ones, but it doesn't make sense to us intellectually or unless we can give meaning to it. And then thirdly, the logical or conceptual would be the encoded representation of the data. So that would be like, what program is it in? I've got a text document, but is it in TextEdit? Is it in Word? Is it in Google Docs? Is it in a PDF? Is it on a website? Those that would be the final component that would be really important to understand about your item, no matter the format. Next slide, please. Okay, so tying in, this is sort of like a separate framework. FAIR principles. This is something else that sort of guides how we think about metadata. FAIR, F-A-I-R, F-A-I-R stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. And kind of the tagline for FAIR principles is, when we've got data, when we've got digital stuff, we want it to be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. If something is private, if it's for a hospital or for a school, it needs to be, there's a certain expectation, there's a certain requirement for it to be closed. Maybe you have some data about students at a school and you're not going to give out their names, but you might say 50% of our students are operating at this reading level. So that's as open as it's possible to get with that data. and it's as closed as it needs to be to follow the law and to align with ethical principles. So the F for findable, the richer the metadata, the more findable it is. You also, the F would cover a unique identifier. If you've got a database full of artworks and many of them have the title untitled, that's not going to work for finding the specific one that you want. So it's not very good for findability. Accessible is the concept of when you as the user can get to the data easily. Hopefully you don't have to have a special app or program to be able to access it or download it. If I want to check out a book from my local library, I can just use a web browser. I can use whatever web browser is on my phone. Maybe I want to download the library app, but I shouldn't have to. So that would be accessibility. Interoperability, also important with metadata. Metadata uses a standard language. So like if I've got stuff, I've got some digital objects, maybe I work in a small historical society and it's in a town, and the next town over also has a small historical society, but we're going to combine maybe at the county level. If I use title for the documents and photos that I have, but somebody else uses name, that's going to be a problem. So to make our metadata interoperable, to combine our collections, we're going to have to decide, like, do we want to change all of the names to have the column? It would probably be in a spreadsheet, like a column heading, change it to title. Would that be better? Because we've got to agree. So that would be the interoperability between systems. And then reusability. So not only is it well described, everything's accurate, you're calling a cat, but what you're allowed to do with it is very clear. Medical data, very important rules, what you're allowed to do with it. Same with schools. Depending on who owns it, a historical society may not want anybody to just take a photo from their repository and share it wherever. They might want credit, they might want attribution. So that would go with the reusability, and licensing is part of that as well. So hopefully you can see how FAIR principles relate to metadata as we go on through the rest of the talk. Next slide, please. Okay, Dublin Core. Dublin Core is something where if people have heard of metadata, you've probably heard of Dublin Core. These are the simple 15, or like the core 15. These are the 15 elements. So if you were, say, not working for a giant organization and just kind of doing this on your own, you might have a spreadsheet, and the columns would each have, maybe you'd have 15 columns, and the top of each would have each of these. Title would go in the box underneath, contributor, and so on. Dublin Core, why is it called Dublin Core? It was named partly for a 1995 metadata conference hosted by OCLC, which is the Online Computer Library Center, located in Dublin, Ohio. So not Dublin in the UK. And that's the origin of where this metadata standard came to be. They're like, people are calling things title, they're calling things, some people are calling it creator. What's contributor? What's creator? Some people are saying month and year for their date. Some people are saying month, day, year. We have to get this. We have to get this organized. So that was the effort of the Dublin Core, and it's persisted and expanded into different types of metadata schemas. PREMIS being one of them. Okay, next slide, please. We're still in Dublin Core, just to give you kind of a foundation to jump off to PREMIS from when we get there. So this is a metadata record, a Dublin Core metadata record. You can see it doesn't use all 15. That's okay. That's up to the people who have the stuff. And this is very human readable. There's title, there's creator. Looking down through these, it's if you're, say you're a metadata librarian, or you're doing data entry, maybe you're an intern or a student worker, or maybe you're the head of a library. I don't know. You're like, what? Okay, metadata record. What is it? Under format, you see that it is a PDF. Okay, cool. We're not dealing with books or photos here. Now I understand what this is. From going through all the metadata fields, you should be able to learn a lot about what the item is. This is in English. Okay, maybe it's from an English-speaking country. If it goes sometime into a repository from around the world, people who speak English will be able to just find stuff that they can understand. Okay, good. This is a good record. Next slide, please. Okay, still Dublin Core. It's not the same item, but this is encoded. So this is still human readable, but it's not quite as user friendly. It's a little bit more like HTML or that kind of code. So this is EAD. EAD is like a flavor of XML. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. It's a standard. It's a standard for structuring data in a document format. And EAD is a type of XML that's specifically for archives. So if I'm at my small institution and my town and the other town, we're going to have all of our photos put into a repository that's being provided by the county. Probably that system is going to use EAD. That's how the computers are going to read what we've put together. And you can see here, so like, let's look at a couple of these. Meta name, that's the name that DC creator, and then the content is a person's name, and then subject. Oh, we can see here that subject is repeatable. There's a rule for that. Title cannot be repeatable. We don't want multiple titles for things, but subject can be. If I am a user and I'm interested in both web development and PHP and MySQL, I want to be able to find this item if I type in any one of those subjects. So it's kind of, this is some of how metadata helps us out as users. Next slide, please. Okay, we're on to PREMIS. The real reason we're here today. It's a schema just like Dublin Core, parallel to Dublin Core, stands for Preservation Metadata Implementation Strategies. It's used in conjunction with other schemas. So PREMIS is not going to tell you what are the rules to create a title, because Dublin Core or something like Dublin Core will do that for you. PREMIS is just going to jump in and describe the things that you need, that a repository needs to support the digital preservation process. So it's not super fun, I gotta say. It's kind of like, you know, you've got the title to your car, you've got the deed to your house. You've got to put those maybe in a safe somewhere, maybe in an important folder that you might grab if, you know, if there's an emergency. The PREMIS metadata is kind of similar stuff. It's really only interesting to people who run repositories. Yeah. Next slide, please. I do want to tell you actually where PREMIS came from. Like Dublin Core came from Dublin, Ohio. PREMIS was developed by this working group called Preservation Metadata Implementation Strategies Working Group. It was also convened by OCLC. If you've heard of WorldCat, like almost every library in the world, their library records for books and other items will go into WorldCat. If you go to worldcat.org, that is the grand shining example of interoperability, like why we need interoperability, because if I'm in Missouri, but I want to find out who in the world has this book and it's not in Missouri, I'm depending on the metadata fields when they were submitted to OCLC to be interoperable. Okay, so yeah, OCLC, big mover and shaker in the field. So that's how it started, and you know, they created, you know, kind of probably fought a lot about how to make these rules, and then it's being maintained. So the schema has to be maintained over time into perpetuity. It's being maintained by something called the PREMIS Maintenance Activity, led by the Library of Congress. So out of OCLC's domain and into LOC. So Yeah, so like I said, big repository nerds are the people who really get excited about premise, but look at all these important things that it does. We would not be able to manage, preserve, and archive digital files and metadata without it. We ensure that they're usable long term. So at my small town historical society, maybe I hold a lot of the knowledge there, the people who work with me, maybe we created a lot of the organization and structure there. What about when we're no longer there? We want to make sure that the stuff is usable long term. So having an eye towards taking care of some of the functions that PREMIS does will accomplish that. It also helps design, evaluate, and exchange archived information. Again, job for repository people. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a little bit of a visual. Where does PREMIS lie? And here's the data model for PREMIS. So there's other kinds of metadata. I like to look at the top circle, descriptive metadata, because that's much easier for me to wrap my mind around. That's the stuff like, okay, I've got a cat. What color is it? Is it, maybe I've got a database of cat photos. Oh, some of them are sitting, some of them are lying down. Which are the photos that contain multiple cats? Um, any descriptive metadata would go in that top bubble. There's other types of metadata that would be how they come into being would be dictated by other schemas. There's Dublin Core, there's PREMIS. If you're describing visual resources, there's another schema called VRA by the Visual Resources Association that would cover things like Dublin Core is not going to give you a field for, is it an oil painting or is it a watercolor? VRA will. VRA will have rules about how do we describe a painting to make sure that when somebody searches for watercolor, all of the watercolors come back. So PREMIS links all of these together. It's the super long-term, put it in the safe, the Fort Knox sort of stuff aspect of description. Next slide, please. Okay, so who needs to use or understand PREMIS? There's kind of three levels here. If you're developing a digital repository, say you're a technology company and you're like, I know there's art museums out there that want to show all of their works to the general public. We want to design a special database or like a web app that they could use. Those people would care about PREMIS very much. If you manage a digital repository, say you are working for a small archive and all of your photos and postcards and stuff like that, they're all in an Omeka instance. You would want to have some familiarity with PREMIS. Or anybody who manages digital items. Maybe you're a student worker for an archive. You don't really need to know a lot about PREMIS, but you should understand that there is metadata that makes sure that long-term preservation happens to this postcard where you're typing in the title for it. Next slide, please. Okay, so PREMIS, how PREMIS happens is usually in those repositories, those web apps, those big databases that a medium to large company would pay for. But maybe you don't have that. Maybe you just have Excel sheets or Google Sheets. Anybody can use the concepts of PREMIS. It's developed to a very high, very nerdy level, but it can be brought to the level of anybody who is taking care of digital stuff. So I'm going to go over these four concepts. Inhibitors. So an inhibitor would be any feature of an object that's intended to inhibit access, use, or migration. What inhibits access? Passwords. That could include password protection or encryption. So if you have, say you work for an archive for a family, a family that's been very influential in a community for generations, they might have some Excel sheets in your repository that's password protected. That needs to go in the inhibitor field in your spreadsheet. Provenance. Uh, Digital provenance is the record of the chain of custody and the change history of a digital object, same as for physical objects. So if your institution created the object, the circumstances of its creation are an important part of its provenance. This is a really old text document. It was created in WordPerfect in 1995. But in the year 2001, I was like, oh man, we're about to get a new computer. It's not going to have a floppy drive. I need to migrate. So that would go into digital provenance. Started out as WordPerfect or WordStar, something like that. And it became a no, first it became a Word doc, and then maybe now it's become a Google Doc. That's all provenance. Significant properties. So those are the characteristics of the object that should be maintained through the preservation process. So if you have a document, is it only the words and images that are critical, or is it the fonts, the background, the formatting, and other look and feel sorts of things that are important? I do a lot of web archiving, and the reason that we don't save the contents of web pages as text files is because the look and feel is so important. Like that's web design is super important. Oh, our website is 10 years old. We need a new one. We need a new one so badly because look and feel is super important to the people who have things on the web and use things on the web. So significant property could be a look and feel sort of a thing. Maybe you've got all these WordPerfect documents from a very famous author who's kind of was only around until 1995. You might want to take screenshots of those before they're not accessible anymore. That would retain the look and feel. Rights. Okay, rights information. It's not unique to preservation, but knowing what you can do with an object is really important to the preservation process. You should be careful to record any known rights information, including copyright status, license terms, and special permissions. Next slide, please. Okay, where does PREMIS take us to? Metadata harvesting. I think the idea of metadata harvesting is super exciting. I don't really get involved with it, but think about that, like OCLC, that WorldCat, the catalog of the world. They are the people who have done all of the metadata harvesting. It's possible that, so like the small town independent historical society, who maybe the only way you can really learn what they have is to go there in person. Maybe a lot of it is still in paper, maybe it's still in binders, but eventually, as time allows, as budget allows, this stuff will, at some point down the line, they might get an intern to make an Excel database. Maybe in years or generations from now, they'll put it online. We're heading towards increasing ability to harvest things. It could be like, now if I'm interested in a small town in Michigan, I have absolutely no way to see their stuff unless I go there. That's probably not going to be the case in a decade or two or a generation or two. So metadata harvesting, the exclamation point is just because it's so exciting and there's just so much potential in the future. We can look to, anybody can go to worldcat.org and see like a really accessible example. So yeah, here's kind of the dictionary definition of what that looks like. OAI PMH, they are kind of the big player in the field as far as like, we've got like PREMIS and other organizations that really put a lot of care and intellectual rigor into making sure that metadata is taken care of. It's kind of whipped into shape, but OAI PMH are the people who were really leading us into metadata harvesting. Yeah, that's kind of all I know about that. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Sorry, that's just kind of like a teaser. But yeah, we're going to move on. Okay, PREMIS, the data dictionary. This is a screenshot of PREMIS itself. What is PREMIS? What does it look like? If it were physical, it would be like a brick. It would be like a Bible. I made sure to include in my screenshot here the PDF. It has 283 pages. So while we want to understand PREMIS, I think we can also be very grateful that usually the program or the app takes care of most of it for us. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit more about the nuts and bolts. Think about the Dublin core, the simple 15. That's the data dictionary. There's more than 15, but 15 are the most common. I don't actually know how many are in PREMIS. I assume it's a lot because of the 283 pages, but yeah. So in Dublin Core, we call them fields or elements. If you've got a spreadsheet, you might call them columns. In PREMIS, we call them semantic units. I find that intimidating, but yeah. So semantic units represent the minimum amount of information, number one, necessary to support the long-term preservation of digital objects, and number two, that must accompany a digital object as it is transferred from the custody of one preservation repository to another. So that's that harvesting that I'm so looking forward to. One of the main principles behind PREMIS is that you need to be very clear about what you're describing. Hence, you can see this is very hierarchical. It's in camel case. So if you look at number 1.1, object identifier, camel case is like the big, it has like humps. So we want all of the characters in this, we could call it a column heading object identifier. We want them to all run together for the ease of the computer to deal with it. But we want, as humans, to be able to read, it's two words. It's object identifier. So we capitalize identifier. Like the humps of a camel. Yeah, it's got big letters throughout. So, yeah, we can see there's this hierarchy going on under semantic unit 1.1. We've got 1.1.1. We've got 1.1.2. Really complex. Okay, let's move on. Next slide. Here is a PREMIS semantic unit. So a semantic unit, analogous to an element and other metadata schemas. If this was Dublin core, the semantic unit might be title. Here, the semantic unit is special. It's particular to PREMIS. It's the inhibitor type. So that would be that password or password sort of a thing that's important for preservation. And this is, I don't know, I thought it would be nice to just kind of browse through. Does it have semantic components? None. Here's the definition of it. The inhibitor method employed. Okay, not super illuminating, but other rules about it. What object category is it in? Does it apply to the file? Does it apply to the bit stream? What are examples of it? What are repeatability? Repeatability, again, I think it's easiest to understand. You don't want to repeat a title, but you may want to repeat a subject. Date, you don't want to repeat a date. You might want to have different date fields, like you might want to have a creation date for creation of the object, and you might want to have a creation date for when you created this record, when you sat down to type it into your computer. So repeatability would be, in all of these items here, would be something that the data dictionary would explicate for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is our final result. Okay, so if we were managing a digital repository and we had to go into the back end of it and make sure that I got to make sure all of my student workers are doing their data entry accurately, and make sure that when I'm in charge of my organization, when it gets harvested by another organization, that the metadata is going to be interoperable. So this was sort of like looking for bugs in your code. We can see here that it refers to The data dictionary would reside at www.loc.gov. That's the Library of Congress. So these are the rules that we use to create this. And again, kind of like HTML or other code, it's got brackets, but if we needed to, we could read it. So this is a PREMIS record in its most robust form, the XML form, special flavor of XML, EAD, which is the archival version of XML. So this is it. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of a visual. Let's look on the right. We've got our repository. So that's our, it could be Amazon.com. All of our pictures are listings of items that we could buy. It could be our, it could be Seattle Art Museum, sam.com. All of the pieces of art that live in that museum. And those, then moving a little bit to the left, we see all those records, multiple records. Those live in the repository. And then towards the right, we've got schemas. The schemas inform the application profile, which are used to describe the records, and the records are housed within the repository. And that's the whole picture. Next slide, please. Okay, that's basically it. Kind of bring us back to basics. There's a quote here from Jonathan Sunderland, who's kind of a big player in the field. Data without metadata is like a supermarket full of tins with no labels. Think how awful that would be. So that's how we digital archivists think about if our digital objects did not have metadata. So yeah, kind of nerdy, super niche, but hopefully you have a greater understanding of how metadata works behind the scenes and how PREMIS as preservation meta does that as well. So we'll do questions in a little bit. Happy to take questions from anybody, but I'm going to hand it back over to Emma.
We'll do questions in just a minute. Let me plug our next webinars. So again, Backlog's name of my company. So our next webinar is on provenance and original order, which compared to this one is very, very basic. But sometimes it's good for a refresher to kind of see, like what are our building blocks and our principles. And then we're also going to do one on our archival hierarchy. So, like how does everything fit in together when we're describing and arranging a collection. And then in June, we're going to do one on metadata object description schema, which is mods. And then I think we also just decided to do DAX in September or August. So I just kind of planned out a lot of the year. But if you're interested in like more information, Sarah did a really great webinar on email archiving back in November. So we have that up on our YouTube channel. It's just Backlog Archivists, and we have all of our recordings. I think we have like 20, 25 webinars up there if you want to take a look. And so if we don't have a chat, but if you'd like to ask a question, you do have to unmute. And you can raise your hand, or I think we're a small enough group that if you just want to shout out, and we'll give it a minute or two. I know for me, it's always like helpful to see, and Sarah, thank you for opening with this, like how everything like connects. So like you did Dublin Core and then EAD, and then I think it's just kind of nice to see how everything works together. So thank you for that.
Yeah, preservation is really important. It's something we don't like to think about, in our everyday. It's kind of like going to the dentist, or going to the mechanic. It's like, I don't really want to do it, but I love having done it. I love knowing that I don't have to worry about it. So preservation and preservation metadata are kind of in that category.
Okay. All right, well, if there are no questions, we'll kind of wrap it up for tonight. But my email is on the screen. If you have questions, I can pass them along to Sarah. Yeah. So So thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. And I'm happy that we could get this on the calendar and it will be up soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.